they see one of your URLs anywhere. And I also believe it's important for you to think about how that first interaction happens and what sort of ideas you're conveying through those URLs. I'm going to talk about today how we know that this is the case and what it means practically for you, and how to go about designing those URLs so that the user's experience is crafted carefully from the very beginning of their interaction. Before we can get into that, I'd like to touch on what a URL actually is. Now, there's a lot of technical definitions that describe what URLs are made up and how they're encoded and stuff like that, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'd like to talk about the bigger picture. And to understand what a URL is, you have to first understand what the web is. The web is the single biggest collaborative knowledge sharing effort ever undertaken by the human race, which, you know, sounds very dramatic, but I believe it really is true. We've all worked together to create this globe-spanning ad hoc machine that anyone can contribute to with a little effort and a little knowledge. And just like any other machine, there has to be some way for humans to interact with it to make it useful to us. The way we interact with this global machine is through HTTP and various other protocols, but since this is a web conference, I'm focusing on HTTP. Vyacheslav Egorov, who's a Russian compiler engineer, recently said, "We're building plans around languages we speak to the machine." And when I came in here to get set up, there was a discussion going on that involved some of this stuff, how there's various software development communities, and you know, if you get started with one language and feel like part of that community, there's, you know, often some animosity between the various language communities. But what it all boils down to is that everyone ends up talking HTTP at some point when they want to get their information out there to people. URLs are the nouns in the language of HTTP. They're the things, the discrete objects that we're referring to. They're how we speak to the web and how we speak with each other about the web. The Platonic ideal URL is a short, semantic, well-defined, unchanging string of characters that refers to a specific thing and tells us how to find that thing in this global machine. The programming languages that Mr. Egorov is referring to are for the specific individual physical machines, but they all talk to each other through HTTP. And without the URLs as part of that language, the communication breaks down. So why design URLs? Well, because people care, and because machines care, and just because we can. People care consciously and unconsciously about the URLs that they're seeing. If something looks incredibly complex, that turns people off. If it looks nice and easy to use, that is more interesting to them, more understandable. How they care about them depends on who they are and how they're using these URLs. If you're a developer looking at URLs for an API that tell you how to interact with another system, you're going to look at those URLs differently than if you're a consumer and you see a URL in an advertisement. A Microsoft research eye tracking study conducted in 2007 determined that on average, people spent about 24% of their time looking at the URLs in search results, no matter whether they were looking for specific information or trying to find a specific site. They spent a good chunk of their time looking directly at the URLs, not at the keywords, not at the descriptions. There's a school of thought that says, oh, the URLs don't matter. People are just gonna, type in their keywords and click on whatever looks best. And it turns out that what looks best depends in part on the URL that you've given it. Jacob Nielsen, that same year, did some studies and found the same thing, that people are actually assessing your URLs and trying to find out which page that they've been presented with is going to contain the information that they want, partly based on what the URL looks like. So what does this mean? Well, you don't just click on something that, has the right title and has the right description. You're going to look at the whole thing and evaluate all the parts. Machines care about URLs. Well, machines don't actually care yet. But in some ways, they have needs and they have expectations about the URLs that you're sending to them. For instance, the machines located at Google care a lot about the URLs that you've put on a page. They're going to analyze those, and that's going to affect your business goals when people are searching for your website or for your information. And finally, we design URLs because we can. No matter what part we play in the creation of websites, we care about all of the process. We care about every bit of work that goes into creating those websites, and part of that is building the URLs for it. We don't just toss things up on the web and say, okay, it's out there. We say, how is this going to be out there? How are people going to find it? So what makes a URL? Well, every URL on the web is going to start with a scheme or a protocol. We're used to seeing these two most of the time. But there's various other ones that you'll encounter on typical websites. The Internet Assigned Numbers Authority recognizes over 160 different schemes or protocols, either on a permanent or provisional basis, including things like Skype and IRC and various ones that aren't seen or used too much, but they recognize them. For the most part, we're just going to stick with the standards here. After that, you've got a domain name, which is usually a name and a top-level domain. Top-level domains come in the generic top-level domains, of which there are a good handful. Most of the time, they're going to fall into those first four, but you'll see these on a regular basis. There's also the country code top-level domains for various nationalities. There's hundreds of those now, and they change on a regular basis. At one point, I was really hopeful that I could register ry.an, and then the Netherlands Antilles dissolved as a country, and they retired the country code top-level domain, so I can't do that. There's infrastructure top-level domains, which is currently just .arpa. Back when the internet was first being created, the Advanced Research Projects Agency used .arpa to refer to their various machines. And over time, that got changed into the address routing protocol area, which is used only in DNS lookups. You'll see that if you're looking up a specific domain name, trying to map into an IP address, you'll see .arpa showing up in the results. If you own and operate a top-level domain, the name isn't actually required. So if you're the one who runs the .ws top-level domain, you can host your website at WS. This gives you some benefits of having the shortest possible URL out there, which is just an interesting thing, but it's not actually going to apply to most of us. And then finally, there's internationalized domain names. This is Tamil for example.test, and using the Punycode algorithm, we can take those Unicode characters and turn them into standard lower ASCII, which makes this beautiful long string of characters that people can type in to get to a Tamil domain name. International domain names are still kind of a mess. It's been a problem that people have understood existed for 15 to 20 years, and there have been a couple of attempts to try and standardize how it's done, but implementation is patchy across the board. They're still working on trying to figure that out. So to be technically accurate here, I'm referring specifically to HTTP URLs, but we have the scheme, the domain name, a path, which can have any number of segments, a resource, a query, which can have any number of parameters and values, and a fragment. Except sometimes you don't have the domain name, you have an IP address. And sometimes you don't have an IPv4 address, you have an IPv6 address, which has brackets and then a whole bunch of hexadecimal strings. And sometimes you have a subdomain or a host name, and you can have a port number in there and a username and password. And Tim Berners-Lee proposed that we can stick parameters into our path segments as well. This is called matrix URIs. So you could put those into any number of the path segments if you wanted. The point is that URLs can be extremely complicated and extremely intimidating, but for the most part, we're working with modern constraints and modern frameworks. and we don't have to worry about all that crap. We're just going to have a domain name, a protocol, a domain name, path, a query string, and sometimes a fragment. Now, what makes a URL good? Well, a good URL is the sum of good parts. You have to consider every piece of the puzzle when you're constructing something. And just having a general plan, like, oh, we're not going to have any encoded characters or whatever, that's not going to cut it. You have to really cover all of the bases. And in this case, the bases when you're designing a website are, you have the known knowns, the URLs that you've planned for from the beginning. You say, we're going to have an about page, we're going to have a contact page, and here are the URLs for those. You have the known unknowns, which are auto-generated from user interaction. It's when a user posts something on a blog, how are you going to create the URL for that? Or when they upload 300 new products to their store, you need URLs for every one of those. And finally, there's the unknown unknowns, which are added in the future after you get hit by a truck, because at some point, hopefully metaphorically, we're all going to get hit by trucks and move on to another project. Somebody else is going to have to take over our code base, and we want them to know, here's the plan for creating new URLs in this system. We'll get to that sort of plan later. First, let's talk about the various parts of the URL and how to make them good. A good domain, short, memorable, speakable, and readable, which is what everyone thinks about at first. It needs to strike a balance between all these because you can't always have everything. You're not going to be IBM and have something like IBM.com, which is all of these things and associates strongly with the brand and is great. We have to get creative these days. You have to consider making your domain speakable. Anders Ramsey, who is a UX designer in Brooklyn, says you might look at this and say that's a really strong domain name. It has good keywords, it's nice and compact. But when you say it out loud, you're saying real-estate.com or real-estate.com, and over the phone, someone might not be sure whether you're saying a different word in the middle there and stuff. They might have trouble with that. So you could consider something like this, where when you say it over the phone, it's realestateonline.com, which is fairly unambiguous. People are not going to have much difficulty with that. The standard litmus test for the visual presentation of a logo design is to fax it, because when you send it through a fax machine, you know, your nice, carefully crafted logo is converted into a two-color bitmap and sent at low bandwidth and printed out on thermal paper. And if the person on the receiving end can see this and say, oh yeah, I know that company, I recognize the logo, then that probably means it's conveying the information that it needs to. So similarly, the good litmus test for a domain is to go stand in the middle of a busy intersection with traffic coming by and call someone on the phone and tell them your domain name. And if they can end up at your website, then it's probably a good speakable domain. You also have to consider making your domain readable. DJ Ill-Jill might have trouble getting people to our website because they can't tell what letters those are. Or the second one, you're not really sure whether it's about having a nice morning or having a nice mother. So the font choice and how it's rendered makes a difference. And you know, if someone is writing down your domain name by hand, you want it to be clear what they're trying to write out for someone else. So I'll give some examples of bad domains. The .jobs top-level domain started registrations in 2005. It was designed to allow companies to set up career websites, post all of their job listings on a nice short domain. Research in Motion, the makers of BlackBerry, set up their job site in 2011 at this domain. It didn't last very long, and they eventually changed their company name and got rid of the site because it just wasn't a good idea. There was another company that tries to gather statistics from online gambling sources to tell you what your chances are of winning. They set up their site at this. I did a Google image search and found this. That's Freud driving that tractor. They've changed their name and domain since then as well. Bad domains can also be intentional if you're trying to make a point or parody or satire or something. For instance, there's Flash game designers at that's5rs.com, which just saying it out loud causes all sorts of confusion, but you know, their whole point is satirizing the Flash games industry. And there's the infamous Welsh town with the ridiculously long name that's hosted a ridiculously long URL that no one's going to be able to type. A good URL also has a good path. It needs to reflect the information structure. When you're putting together a website, you say, here's what we're trying to present to the world, here's the various categories and subcategories, and your URLs should reflect that sort of information. You should be going from most general to most specific. In his book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, Edward Tufte coined the term chart junk, which is the needless visual flourishes that are added to informational graphics that don't actually help it convey the information anymore effectively, but just make it look prettier. Jesse James Garrett at Adaptive Path took that and coined the term CMS junk, which is when you depend on your framework to generate URLs for you, they're often full of, you know, acronyms and IDs and stuff that just don't convey anything useful to humans and are only there for the machines. So you should definitely try to avoid that sort of thing. Your URL should be usable to a machine, definitely, but it should be actively friendly to the humans who are going to be using it. You need to have a good query. Basically, normal humans who look at a URL with a query string on the end, if there's too much there, they're going to be intimidated. This happens regularly if we have some sort of complex string showing up on a page with lots of punctuation and stuff. Our clients will say, why is there code all over the page? And as developers, we say, that's not code, that's, you know, just whatever. But people who aren't dealing with computers on a regular basis look at that and feel like this is just something out of my, you know, sphere of knowledge. Google, for instance, doesn't always generate good URLs and query strings. This is depending on what you're logged into and how you're using it. You can go to Google and type in a search term and get something like this, which is especially vexing because you can also get a URL like this that gives you the exact same results and is nice and simple. Really, all that this URL needs is the single parameter in its query string. And if you can possibly get by with that, then that's definitely the best path in terms of query strings. Does anyone here know how browsers parse URLs in terms of the character encoding? Well, it turns out that's actually a fairly complex question. Everything up to the question mark is parsed using UTF-8. So that's nice. It's a good standard character set that we can all depend on. Everything after the question mark, though, is parsed depending on the document's encoding. So if you've written a document on a machine using something like Windows 1251, which is an Eastern European character set, then the query string is going to be parsed using that on the receiving end. And if they're not used to that, it's going to be confusing in some way. However, if your document is written using UTF-16, you said, I want to use this great, you know, incredibly inclusive character set, it's going to be parsed as UTF-8, just to confuse you. Basically, when in doubt, you should use UTF-8, and when you're not in doubt, you're probably wrong, and you should still use UTF-8 because it's just standard. It's a good idea. So what about special characters? If I want a URL with a table flip in it, for instance, that's going to show up in most cases as something like this. This is percent encoding. It's how we turn unusual characters into something that can be displayed on any system, even if it's just using standard low ASCII. However, the rules for how we percent encode is different depending on which part of the URL the special characters are showing up in. The question is this. In the path, the plus symbol is fine unescaped, and spaces become %20. In the query, the plus symbol becomes %2b, and spaces can be %20, or they can be a plus sign that doesn't get encoded there. It's essentially impossible to remember the set of characters that's going to be encoded for each segment of your URL. It turns out it's slightly different for each part as well, which, sort of on a tangent, this URL is perfectly valid and doesn't require any % encoding, but it's basically a mess, so don't do this. The good news is that there's a Dutch Mozilla engineer named Anna van Kesteren who's working on a new URL specification for the WhatWG that is going to be improving how URLs are handled and how character encoding is done, and also exposes a new JavaScript API to handle URLs and construct them and deconstruct them as needed. So when that is finished and lands in browsers, it's going to be a big step up. Finally, you need a good fragment. Basically, a fragment is the location in a document, and that's all it should be. If at all possible, only use it to refer to a section down in your document that you want people to be able to link to directly. For a long time, there was no way for JavaScript changes to the page to indicate in your browser history that the page had changed. So people would click something and new content would load via Ajax, but the URL wouldn't change. And the person would say, okay, I want to go back to what I was looking at before, and hit the browser's back button, and they'd end up on a different page entirely. So developers said, okay, I'm going to change the fragment in the URL to indicate that we're on a different page. And this worked, you know, it was a solution for the time. But now we have the history.pushState API that allows us to actually change the entire visual URL through JavaScript to manage that same thing. And the only reason to still depend on the old fragment change hack is if you have to support older versions of Internet Explorer, which is the usual reason for anything. So what's the rest of the puzzle? We have the scheme, domain, path, query, and fragment dealt with. There's more factors to consider that apply to everything, the URL as a whole, and each one of these things again. First, a good URL is credible. This is the skeptical chihuahua. When you're looking for information, you have to be skeptical about the credibility. You have to say, how do I know that what I'm looking at is actually going to give me the information that I need? It's actually going to be from someone who knows what they're talking about. You need to be able to look at a URL and say, okay, that looks like the right page to click on. Based on that Microsoft study, what the users are actually looking for when they're assessing a URL is credibility. Credibility is partly based on reputation. Reputation is trustworthiness, expertise, and accuracy. When you know that a site has given good information before, you can hopefully trust that it's going to give you good information again. If you're searching for information on chinchillas, you might get these two URLs as possibilities. One of them has a better reputation than the other one. Wikipedia is usually edited by some people who know what they're talking about, and they can cite their sources, and you can usually depend on that. And everyone knows that Joe Banana is a total fraud, so he has no good reputation. Credibility is also based on association. If you are associated with something credible, it rubs off on you. You look more credible as well. Say you're looking for something a bit more technical, like a description of a new cryptography algorithm. You might find these two URLs. And this is a little less cut and dry because they're both perfectly valid, perfectly well-designed URLs. But the first one is hosted at Carnegie Mellon, which is a known research institution with people who know what they're talking about for the most part. It's a paper written by a staff member. It's probably going to have really good low-level information about this. The second one is probably going to have a good overview. It may get into some of the technical aspects, but it just looks like an online magazine or blog. It may not have the depth of information that you want. The association of the first one to a known, credible institution makes it a stronger choice here. There's a concept in cognitive neuroscience known as processing fluency. It turns out that when something is easier for your brain to process, you believe it to be more credible and more true. Even making slight changes to a statement that make it easier for someone to understand makes them believe that it's true more often, even if you haven't changed the content in any way. So adding alliteration or rhyme or repetition to something can do this. A study found that in the weeks following their IPO, companies with a name that was easier to pronounce actually performed better in the stock market. Good URLs are hackable. There's there's long been a negative connotation to the word hack, but originally it meant messing around with something to get it to do what you want it to do. So hacking a URL is not about stealing passwords or figuring out how to, delete their database or something. Hacking a URL is about skipping the traditional navigation methods for a site, skipping the traditional interaction models. It's finding a way to change the URL to do what you want to do a little bit quicker. It's definitely a power user shortcut. When you're used to using a site and you understand how to hack the URL to do what you want, you can get more done quicker. Something like this is not hackable. It contains a lot of information, but if you try and explore the site just by changing the URL, you're going to run into 404 pages pretty quickly. If you say, hey, I like the Tovolo brand, I might want to see what else they have, and you chop off everything after Tovolo, it just goes to a 404 page. Amazon is forcing you to use their on-page navigation. Something like this is hackable. You say, oh, Michael Burke has made a nice package here. I'll just chop that off and see what else he's done, and it works. You get to his profile page. And if you know somebody else has written some open source code, then you can say, oh, I can just stick their username instead of Michael Burke's and get to their profile that way. So who cares? Well, as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a study about hackability of URLs, but anecdotal evidence everywhere across the web says this is a good thing. I love being able to do this. So it's probably a good idea. I'm sorry I don't have any good citation for that. In his book, The Humane Interface, Jeff Raskin, who's a legendary UX designer, basically said that good interfaces allow users to form habits. If the interface is predictable and consistent, then you can say, okay, I know exactly what to do no matter what when I'm looking at this interface. And when you form a habit, that makes you into a more loyal user. You say, this is a tool I can use quickly, I know how to use it, I'm going to come back to this because I'm just used to it. So if you make hackable URLs, people are going to find those shortcuts and say, okay, this is a habit I can form. Something that's hackable, like I said, is the github.com/username pattern. If you know someone's Twitter username, you should follow that guy. He's pretty awesome. You can go and stick it on GitHub and say, oh, hey, look, they've done some open source work. That's pretty great. Whereas something like this is not hackable, and you can't form a habit. If you try sticking someone else's username on the end and you don't know their user ID in the system, it's just not going to work. While we're talking about hackability, let's talk about slugs. Slugs are short, keyword-rich summaries of the content of a document. The term comes from print media. At a newspaper or magazine, when an article was being passed around from editor to editor, they would come up with a quick way to refer to it. Instead of the article about this new thing that was written by this person, it would just be, a two-word summary of this thing that they would refer to it. So the web has co-opted that into their own usage. Slugs don't add to the hackability of a URL, but if you implement them correctly, they can also not detract from the hackability. They do benefit the readability, the credibility, and the searchability of URLs. If this is the canonical URL to a document, that last bit is the slug, and someone tries to request this, you should make it redirect to the canonical URL. The basic slug rules have been essentially standardized for a long time. You don't need to reinvent the wheel when you're adding slugging to a system. There's literally dozens of packages on Packagist to handle this in PHP, and probably hundreds more for any other language that you can find. And it's generally just a good idea to add slugging as long as you do it properly. Let's talk about sharing. Sharing has become a huge activity on the internet. As social networks have gained prominence over the last decade or so, people have just taken to sharing everything that they find. If it's at all interesting, you want to show it to your friends, you want to send it to your family. We've already talked about making your URLs short, sensible, and snappy. What else can you do to make them more shareable? You need to think about robustness. Something that's robust is hard to screw up when you share it. For instance, here's a URL. Like I said, if you go without the slug, you should get a 301 sending you to the right place. If you go to this URL that has a truncated slug on the end, you should still get redirected to the right place, because copy and paste errors shouldn't penalize the end user. If someone tries to copy a URL and doesn't quite get it, if you can still figure out what they're looking for, then give it to them. Just don't say this is the canonical URL. Say, it's actually located over here. Try checking that. However, if someone actually changes the slug, you shouldn't support that, because then Google can possibly index something at the wrong URL and your site's not going to look quite right. Additionally, you should avoid generating URLs that contain encoded characters, because often in the process of copying and pasting something, you can have those % signs get double encoded, and then things just aren't going to work. The URL's not going to lead to the right place. But sharing isn't only done online. There's also old-fashioned sharing, which is, hey, this is a great site. Here, let me write it down for you. This kind of URL is not great for that. URLs are shared by hand like this. They're shared by speaking. They're printed in newspapers and magazines. They're written by skywriters. They're stitched into clothing. They're all over the place, and you have to consider when you're designing a URL, how is this going to show up in all of these various offline media as well. Basically, you need to make them short so they're easy to type, and you need to make them unambiguous so it's easy to understand what you're supposed to be typing when you actually end up at your computer. You want to avoid ambiguity. Low ASCII contains a lot of characters that, depending on your font, can look a lot alike. If you can possibly avoid ambiguous strings like this, you should. If you have a company that, for instance, is named Zero Range and you register zerorange.io, you'd better also register orange.io, because no one's going to have any idea that that's a zero. So there's also newfangled sharing, which is you want to get your URL into someone's phone as they're walking down the street, for instance. You could use a QR code, but you may not want to. And if you're not sure about this, here's a handy flowchart. There's a better way to get URLs into mobile devices. It's time to consider URL shorteners. So you've designed a nice URL that, is searchable and readable, works well. Now you say, oh, I want to, share a shorter version of this so that people can type it a lot easier. Well, you could use Bitly. It generates a short, snappy URL. It's quick to type. It redirects to your nice full URL. Provides all sorts of metrics in the back end. It's a win-win, right? No. Third-party URL shorteners are bad for the web and bad for usability. Jason Scott is a digital archivist at the Internet Archive, and for years before that, he was doing digital archiving on his own because he's so dedicated to the craft, and he has thoughts about third-party URL shorteners. I'd like you to take a moment to read this. Third-party URL shorteners add a layer of fragility to your system. They're totally outside of your control. There's zero accountability, no guarantees, no contract with these systems. You're essentially handing off part of your marketing strategy to a black box system that you don't know how it really works. And it eliminates any credibility and readability and searchability that you've crafted into your URLs. If you've worked really hard to make a good URL and then turn it into a Bitly string, anyone looking at that Bitly string is not going to have any idea what they're clicking through. You can tell I'm a big fan of third-party URL shorteners. But you want short URLs anyway. They're undeniably useful. They're incredibly prevalent. Everyone says this is something I want. So what do? You host your own. It's actually much easier than you might think at first. There's a package called URLs that is written in PHP and provides all the same metrics that Bitly can provide, has a thriving plugin ecosystem to add new functionality to it. So all you do, get that set up on your system, tie it in, and start sticking your own short URLs in. This also allows you to handcraft the short URLs and be sure that you're not going to collide with somebody else's desire for a certain short URL. It associates your short URL domain with your brand. Once people have seen it a couple times and clicked through, they say, oh, I know that this link shortener goes to this one site. And something you can do for bonus points is to say, okay, I want to eliminate or reduce the possible error in entering these short URLs. So you can use something like Douglas Crockford's base32 algorithm or my easier encoder that takes those ambiguous characters that I mentioned earlier and says, okay, if a person types a capital O and they were supposed to type a 0, we're going to handle it either way because we know that those two can sometimes be difficult to distinguish. A good URL is canonical. That means you have one URL for one document and anything else you redirect to that URL. An important point here is to make sure you're rewriting those trailing slashes. Typical Apache setup will let you refer to a document with or without a trailing slash, and it's a good idea to just standardize that across your platform. URLs should also be persistent. You should do everything you can to keep old URLs working. This is another good reason to plan your URL design from the start. In 1998, Tim Berners-Lee wrote his document, sorry, I'm forgetting the name right now, but it's basically saying this sort of thing. Once you create a URL, it should be up there forever. It should persist. So if you plan from the beginning to create your URLs in a certain way, then that will allow you to handle that better. In the real world, stuff moves around. Your company gets bought. Third parties will rebuild parts of your system, and your URLs may change. So you need to know your redirect. The standard ones that have been around forever are 301, 302, and 303. These do have the drawbacks of if you're posting data to a page and get one of these, the browser will redirect using a GET and lose all of that posted data. So 307 and 308 are either added or being added to the spec that will allow you to say, oh, you're posting data here, redirect over here and repost the data, which will solve some problems. Additionally, you don't want to expose your implementation in your URLs. If you've built something in PHP now and you rewrite it in Python later, you don't want to have all these .php URLs hanging around. You don't want to have to handle 301 redirecting all of them if possible. Just get rid of that. If you're using MediaWiki as a wiki for your site, don't use MediaWiki in the URL, just say wiki so that you can switch out wiki platforms if you want. And finally, to make sure that your URLs are going to persist, make sure you're paying for your domain name registration. Buy it years in advance. Hopefully your company can afford a couple $100 in domain name fees up front so that you've got a decade's worth of reassurance that your site will stick around. So, if I've done my job, you have an inkling about what makes up a good URL at this point. It's good, memorable, readable, speakable, credible, hackable, shareable, and robust. Now you have to do it for every URL on your site and every URL that will ever be on your site. You can't do this all by hand. You need to make a plan for how this is going to be done over time, how things are going to be implemented to take this into account. We're back to the known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns here. Basically, this can be as simple as just writing it down. Think about it, put down a couple paragraphs and add that to your project plan. If you want, you can look into URI templates, which is another spec that's in progress. It basically says, if your site has URLs that look like this is the template for how you generate those URLs. It specifies a whole formal grammar for how URLs are crafted based on the data that you're presenting. There are a bunch of libraries that help you parse and create this sort of thing, including the URI template PHP extension. But as I said, it's currently in flux right now because they're still working on defining it. So for now, you can be less formal and just write up something that says, here's what we're going to do. I spent some time thinking about this. You're going to create a visual design document. You're going to create a software specification for your project. Just create a URL design document as well. Stick it in there, show it to everyone on the team, and say, let's try and make sure we're crafting good URLs. Here's the basis for that. So why should I care about URLs? Getting back to that quote, the clans that we build around programming languages don't matter in the long run. Programming languages and frameworks and operating systems come and go. The only constant is the web itself. The web's always going to be around. For now and the future, you can safely bet on the web existing and sticking to some of its core principles. You need to embrace things like URLs that make the web what it is. They're a key part of the web, and they're going to outlast these clans. URLs are part of the native language of the web, and if you're going to speak to the web, you need to understand and respect that. Thank you. And if you want to do a little light reading, I have some references.
Light reading.
I did some research for this. And these are the handful of software packages that I mentioned. All right, are there any questions?
So
Sure.
I'm interested in your point about removing the .php at
Yeah.
the end. And it feels like you would have to balance that against the hackability, because now you can't tell if that is a resource or a path.
Well, the question is, does removing the .php make it more difficult for users to tell whether they're requesting a specific resource or just part of a path segment? What it turns out is that it doesn't actually matter. The resource and the path are just sort of interchangeable parts. We treat the last one as the ultimate resource that we're asking for, but that can just as easily refer to a directory of other resources as well. Removing the PHP has benefits to future development that I think outweigh any confusion that users may have. Yeah.
A lot of times what I do is I rewrite the URL. If somebody types it without a slash, it'll just add it for you. So all the site ends with a slash, and then you can put your query string and the fragment at the end.
That's a good
To
point.
be consistent. You
Yeah.
know, choose to keep or remove, and always choose to keep it because sometimes it's like a folder structure.
Right.
Like if you're doing from like the world down to a city to a address, you
Yeah.
slash to go in it.
Yeah, if you want to make your URLs as robust as possible in the back end, you can say, if someone puts a .php on here, I can just send them to the proper URL anyway. You know, we don't need to worry too much about that. Yeah?
So one slide's like kind of link round equals short URL. I've also seen a similar one that's a round canonical. PHP.net actually uses that on there.
Yeah, there's been a debate about that that's actually been going on fairly low level for years. No one's really sure, and there isn't actually a spec saying here's the correct way to do it. But I believe that the rel equals short URL is more widely used, at least at this point. But that could change. Yeah.
I was just curious, have you used any frameworks that use routing? Because certain frameworks like Laravel, for instance, you can route the URL. So I'm sure you have your files that are named whatever without PHP, but you don't use.
Right, the routing gets translated to that in the back end.
Yeah, there's actually some really cool functionality with that, like EPAC and stuff on that.
Yeah.
It's really,
Yeah, routers are really nice. They're a great way to automatically translate your well-crafted path into a specific controller written in your system. All right, anything else? I have a couple of books here that here have PHP design patterns. Here's an HTML5 book for you. All right, thank you very much.